We see war and conflict every day, but it can be difficult to understand what's really going on. Effective and ethical journalism helps audiences to make sense of tough issues and provide empathy for those involved. Meet these students who just returned from Europe, studying World War II, and the journalists who covered it, on this edition of In the Studio. War and conflict are difficult topics to discuss, but they impact our lives and futures in many ways. Welcome to In the Studio, where in each episode we learn more about activities, organizations, and individuals here at Hanover College. We are a group of Hanover students who have been following in the footsteps of reporters in the European theater during World War II, learning about these conflicts, examining media reports, and practicing some journalistic techniques ourselves. I'm Lucas Yates, a sophomore communication major and film minor at Hanover College. Joining me are Vivian Jacobs, a junior communication major, Paige Norton, a sophomore history major, and Cecelia Shick, a junior KIP major.
Hi.
Thanks for having us.
Okay, so let's get started. What have you learned that could inform your work as a reporter when faced with difficult, controversial, or even dangerous assignments?
Yeah, so as a reporter, I've learned how essential it is to document the reality of the situation while also really making sure to maintain the humanity of both the subjects and the audience. And we talked about a lot of different journalists throughout our time abroad, and I think photojournalist Margaret Burke-White exemplifies this balance very well. So when I visited Buchenwald and the Normandy beaches, I initially felt, like many others, that it was disrespectful to walk through and take photos of these sites of tragedy. However, through our class discussions abroad after visiting these sites, we learned that Margaret Burke-White would think that it is very important to document these places as vital evidence, but also just images that should be seen and discussed so that this tragedy is learned about, but also isn't repeated.
Yeah, for sure. When we were doing our interviews in Shoreditch, our man on the street interviews, I learned that when you're doing controversial assignments, maintaining neutrality and allowing the people you're interviewing to really take the reins is important.
I think what's happening at the moment is a trigger of fear about instability.
People feel free to be more vulnerable and honest in responding when the reporter remains neutral.
Yeah, and I just above all, as the reporter, you have to be open to new ideas and ways of viewing the world that are different from yours, because we're quite set in our own ways, and you have to be open to learning about others. And I just feel like if you close yourself off to these new perspectives, you're not gaining anything out of your journalistic experience that we went on. And Shoreditch had a lot of the politically charged graffiti, and that may have for some of us that went on this trip had challenged our perspectives and the ways that we thought about politics, for example, or just anything in the world really, with things we saw a bunch of Free Palestine graffiti, and we saw some posters that were kind of making fun of and poking fun at Elon Musk and Donald Trump, comparing Musk to Benito Mussolini, and calling Trump an XL bully, things such as that whenever we visit there as Americans may feel like an attack on us and who we are just as our identity as Americans, but I think you have to be open to that's not necessarily an attack on us, and just understand where they're coming from with it.
Definitely.
Yeah, I liked all that. A lot of what I thought about was kind of the learning about the dangers of being a reporter. When we visited Normandy and we walked across those battlefields, the whole time I was just thinking that these reporters are here where these soldiers are, risking their lives just as much, and they don't have the combat training, they don't have all that, but they're risking their lives to be able to get this information back home. And when our tour guide was walking us around, and I'm seeing these bunkers and walking on the beach, and just imagining the danger that these people are in, but they're doing their duty and they're committing to their job to be able to go out there and say, hey, I'm going to get this information back to the people, and just thinking about how much passion is in that.
Yeah, and thinking about reporting from an ocean away from home, I was wondering, how do you guys think that we can make an American audience care about what's happening so far away? how do you help them understand what's going on and empathize with the human experience of the events that the reporter is seeing?
Whenever I think of this question, my first initial thought is that you kind of have to pull on the heartstrings a little bit. You have to get to the core of human connections between, siblings, parents. I don't know, all the familial connections, because that's how we feel connected to this world and other people. And if a war is going on, you have to show the people. You have to let them see people that, such as, for me, I'm thinking of my brother, seeing my brother in young, soldiers, rather than those who are, waging it, so the politicians, etc. No one's going to feel connected to that, and you just have to remind them that these are real people with real stories, and it happened a lot with World War II journalism, about Edward Murrow and him making connections and showing how the people were doing specifically, and that was used a lot to try to convince America to join in on the war prior to Pearl Harbor.
Yeah, I think that we all grow up learning about World War II and about these things, and we see it, but I think being there in these places that really helped show me how real the things were. Some of the, going to visiting the memorials and the gravesite of all the American soldiers that were killed. I think if these countries are showing that much dedication to honoring us Americans, then we should be giving just as much of an effort for them. And on top of that, America has such an impact on the rest of the world. As we were there, so many of the news stories that would just be on the BBC news coming on, or one of the news channels in France, a lot of it would be American news, and we don't really get much. I mean, we have big events of international news, but they're taking little things that it's they all know what we're all doing, and we don't really. So I think it's really important that I think us as Americans should just get more informed in general.
Yeah, definitely. I agree with that. Both of what you guys were saying, pulling on the heartstrings too. A way of doing that, I think, is using art and photography and storytelling.
Yes.
How we've talked about all throughout class abroad, as a way just to convey that meaning to an audience, no matter where they are. And then also kind of going off of what you were saying, it's more with the current events. One of the biggest realizations for me was just how deeply the Europeans care about what we're doing and what's happening in America, because they realize the significant influence that America has on their own lives. So while in Shoreditch, London, kind of what you were talking about, we had the opportunity to engage in conversations with the locals, which brought this perspective to life of how they really do feel. And many of them shared that they once admired many different aspects of America and how that's kind of shifted now with the current situation. And I feel like knowing this should concern Americans.
It was my biggest dream ever to move to the US, because that's where you saw that's where all the movies come from and stuff like that. But then as I've gotten older and as I just watch the news, I have completely gone over to the other side, and the interest has it's not there.
Yeah, so like a few of you have talked about, I thought about Normandy and Ernie Pyle's reporting from the invasion. I felt like he really made his reports, they were very vivid, and he made them real to an American audience that wasn't actually with them, with his anecdotal stories. He created characters and settings that really held the audience's attention, and it maintained their investment. He created a connection with the audience, and through his reports that really maintained relevancy with the audience.
Kind of going off of that relevancy, how does our past inform our present? Kind of what parallels do you guys see existing in our current day and age, and what kind of lessons can be learned from it?
I think one of the things that I realized the most when we were there is that war is kind of destined to repeat itself, and it's almost every time in very similar ways. As I mean, we all know with World War II, especially with things like the Holocaust, it was over. You're different than me. It's a different race. I don't like that. Different religion. obviously with what happened with the Jewish people and so many other people there. That's just what has happened in war for forever. It's always over like, this land was promised to me 5,000 years ago, so I should have it instead of you. It's like we can see it in modern day things, like with Israel and Palestine right now, or with Russia and Ukraine. It's these battles over war, over land, and over religion, and over beliefs, and being able to go there and be in these places, especially when we were at the concentration camp. It helped me think like, this is like so much of this war to me is caused in so many for just so many dumb reasons, and it affects so many people. So seeing that, I fear that is going to keep being repeated as it is now. But I think it's important for us to be able to go to those places and look at all this information so that we can try our best to make sure that those things don't happen anymore.
Yeah, when we were at Buchenwald and the Imperial War Museum in London, I feel like there was a lot of emphasis on what the rise of fascism in Europe looked like. And obviously we saw the effects of the literal ways that fascism came into play, but there was also a lot of emphasis on the small ways that it was really integrated into people's lives. And I definitely see some similarities with modern institutions and the rise of right-wing extremism in comparison to the rise of fascism in Europe in the 1930s. So learning about it now, learning about how it gains traction, can really inform the way that we can identify it, and I think it's really important for us.
Yeah, very similarly, I just think it allows us to recognize those reoccurring ideologies and the impact of those decisions that are made by leaders or just groups of people. And just throughout this study abroad experience, I found it very interesting how often parallels were drawn between the historical events that we were studying and the current political climate in the US now. And that those connections were made by our guides, interviewees, and even some of our own group members. And so, for example, at the Buchenwald Museum, there was an exhibit that was explaining the Nazis' rise to power. And it was explaining how during this time there were streets and landmarks and tourist sites that were being renamed. And one of my fellow classmates overheard a German couple that was standing at this exhibit and learning about these changes that were happening, and she couldn't necessarily understand what they were saying, but because it was in German, of course, but there was a pause and they said Gulf of America, and that just kind of took both of us, we were shocked, and it was interesting, like we were more intrigued to learn more of what they were talking about and that connection that they might have been making.
Yeah, and just kind of like all similar to what everyone's been saying, and just kind of around the world, like currently you can see kind of the resurrection of a lot of aspects of fascism that we saw perfect examples of as we were like traversing through Europe. And like kind of, I don't want to say most dishearteningly, because it's disheartening everywhere, but you can see it a lot in American politics currently, which like a specific example I was thinking of whenever I was like looking through the Nuremberg Rally Museum area was how Hitler used economic crisis as a kind of event to scapegoat the Jews and other minorities. And you're seeing a very similar viewpoint of how Trump used a economic crisis to kind of appeal to the masses, even to your average Joe who doesn't like pay that much attention to politics or just human rights in general, may just see, oh, this guy's promising a better economy, so I'll go with it. And just kind of using that economy crisis as a way to stoke kind of that hatred and fear of minorities, and using it as like, well, these immigrants are stealing our jobs, and so we need to be upset at them. And it's very jarring. Like, I knew that there were the parallels there, but it's very jarring to see just how many there are with current American politics and, like the Third Reich and Hitler in the 1930s. And for me, it was just especially upsetting to think about whenever you walk through places like the Imperial War Museum or the beaches like at Normandy, or especially the American Cemetery as well. And you just see the names and ages of all these young like men, but really boys who died in the effort to defeat fascism. And I can't imagine the betrayal that they would feel, them and like veterans who are still living, the betrayal that they feel about this Western descent into fascism that they fought so hard against and lost buddies for and all of that type of thing. And I think it begs the question, like, I have a picture that I took at the Imperial War Museum that talks about, has war brought peace? And it's just kind of, if I were in their shoes, I would be thinking, what did I do all of this for? You know, like, it's a lot to think about.
Hard.
Yeah.
I haven't thought about that. So kind of moving on to our next question, what have you learned in this course that you feel like helps you evaluate media coverage of different events related to war and conflict?
So for me, I really learned how personal reporting is, and that even in context of like war and conflict, precarious social context, that the humanity really shines through, especially in reporting. So yeah, I saw the humanity of all the reporters that we studied and realized that they strive to appeal to audience values in their reporting always, but little pieces of them do exist in every piece of media that they generate.
Yeah, that's a very interesting, I had never thought of it that way. I really like that. Mine is quite different though. I feel like it is, at least. Mine is kind of just, my big takeaway was that the narrative can always be altered, and it can always be kind of, changed from the original, like the way that it happened to fit someone's ideas. Like whenever we walked through the Liberation Museum in Paris, it showed I saw these posters of propaganda, Nazi propaganda, talking about how these liberation and like freedom fighters, like, oh, they are terrorists. And we see a lot of like, oh, these people are terrorists, but it's like, as the perception changes, as the years go on, we see like these French liberating armies like as heroes. But back then, if you were living under German occupation in France, they were painted as terrorists or as these horrible, barbaric people. And then it just was a very good like experience of understanding how propaganda works and the effectiveness of it, and just how much it infiltrates the mind and like being of a society. With like, and we watched that too with like, we talked about when Margaret Burke White would like do her photography, how when she would move around and get certain things in frame or certain things not in frame, like the whole framing, anything can be, I guess, altered, which to show like what the person wants to convey. I guess that does kind of relate back to your, there's pieces of them in every piece of media, I guess.
Yeah.
And then like whenever we went to Buchenwald talking, I never really would have thought of this before. Our guide talking about how whenever the Soviet Union occupied that area of Germany, like how the perception of the Holocaust was different whenever the Soviet Union was occupying like Eastern Germany, and how like Buchenwald was presented differently, and like there was different types of memorials because they just wanted to present it a different way than how America usually presents it. And again, just kind of reaching back into that question about the parallels of everything, how I kind of said this already, honestly, but the Nazi framing like of people as criminals, like these French liberators as criminals, terrorists, etc. I think you just see a lot of parallels to today when it's like the framing of immigrants as criminals, all immigrants as criminals, and all transgender people as like predators. Like these stereotypes and these like things that are pushed onto these minorities, I think there's a lot of things to be said about that we don't have the time to get into. But it's a lot of parallels that you can see, and it's very kind of disturbing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think something that I've learned, and this goes along with what Paige is saying a lot, but I've learned that there's always going to be more behind the story than we know. Like you have a reporter go out and they get a report of a city that got bombed, and then the next day, newspaper comes in, shows all the reports of what things happen. And from an outside perspective, it's like, okay, this is what's going on. But I didn't really understand how much work goes into it on behind the scenes. Like I talked about this earlier, but like people and reporters being on the battlefields and being in there, they are in this war and in these places just as much as anyone else. And we think about it, it's like, oh, these things are happening so far away, and it's like sometimes a lot of these things won't really affect us, but it's the people that are going out there to tell us this, that they're being affected so much. And I love looking at and just seeing all of the different like backstories of things, looking at the reporters that are doing all this. Another thing that kind of goes with this is just when we went to a lot of the museums, especially the one in the concentration camp, I felt that you learn so much that's going on in these places that you have no idea. Because like when people think about the Holocaust, think about like thousands of people that were murdered, the Jewish people that were killed, all this going on, but there's all these different groups of people that aren't talked about as much that were in these places. There are things that were going on that were, some of it was like really graphic, and some of it was really like almost uplifting, because there were things that there was an art museum in that area that was full of art that was made by either people that were in the camps or people that survived and then made this art later. So there's just so much behind the stories that you don't know until you actually get to go to these places, and it was such an interesting experience to do that.
Yeah, definitely. And kind of going off that, I think just understanding the subjectivity of history, but also just the media coverage now as well. Like what we learn about history, war, and conflict isn't just the facts, like what we've talked about in class again a lot. It's a story, and it's shaped by the people that decide to record and emphasize different parts, and so they're influenced by that storyteller's perspective and what their motives are. And I think that's why it's also very essential to critically examine who's telling what story and what's being included, what's being excluded, and the reasonings behind of why and how it's being presented, I think is very important.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think that we've all had a lovely discussion, but before we conclude, did this trip change how you guys thought about any of your favorite World War II or Cold War films?
Yeah, so what immediately comes to mind is that when we were at Buchenwald, our tour guide mentioned that he was really not a fan of The Boy in the Striped Pajamas. Mm-hmm. And I wouldn't necessarily call The Boy in the Striped Pajamas like my favorite Holocaust film, so I have seen a lot, but I thought that it inspired a really interesting discussion, him saying that. He didn't really elaborate on it at the time, but we kind of talked about it as we were waiting for the bus to leave. And as we were chatting, we kind of came to the realization, and I watched it when I was really young, so I did not really watch it with critical eyes, but just thinking about the portrayal, we kind of realized that not only is the storyline a little problematic, but also the audience is kind of pushed to feel sympathetic for the SS officer's family and their son. So obviously that's like a little problematic, asking people to sympathize with Nazis, even though what happened was tragic, but yeah, it seemed like kind of a main objective of the film. So yeah, I found once we kind of examined it together, a few aspects of it to be problematic and also inaccurate, and it definitely changed my perspective a lot.
I agree. I think definitely after this conversation that we had, it makes me want to go back and rewatch this movie with all the knowledge that I do now have.
Yeah. For me, we discussed a lot with our dear friend and tour guide Terry, Band of Brothers, and my nerdy interest in that. I think on the flip side of that coin, what you were saying, how it kind of changed your perception of The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, for me it just kind of enhanced my understanding of, like, obviously World War II as a whole, obviously, but just the, like, every aspect really of that show. It tries so hard to be, like, maintain that historical accuracy and really, like, present this like unit that you're following through the show, if anyone doesn't know about it, like through their time while they're going through the European theater, it really just shows what it was like. And it's just enhanced my appreciation for it and really made me want to learn even more than I already know.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm definitely the same as you about the movie that I picked. Currently at the moment, it's Saving Private Ryan. And so I think that this trip didn't necessarily change how I view the movie, but I think it just, being able to visit Normandy beaches and the Normandy American Cemetery, it made those events feel so much more real, and it deepened like the emotional impact of the tragedy, and it gave me like the greater appreciation of the sacrifice and the honor that those soldiers deserve. And specifically being able to see the Normandy American Cemetery and Memorial, it made me realize the vast number of lives lost and how common it was for brothers to serve together, like in Saving Private Ryan. And we learned a little fact, just that 45 pairs of brothers were buried there and 30 of them were resting side by side. And I just thought that was interesting.
It is really interesting.
Yeah, no, it's all fascinating with all these movies, and I've seen so many like World War II films and stuff. It's some of my very favorite storytelling is found in them, but my favorite has always been Jojo Rabbit, which focuses a lot on Hitler's youth and what it was like for a kid who was in Hitler's youth to like be growing up in Nazi Germany and seeing him as seeing Hitler as like this god and this like their teacher and their friend, and learning about that. And I mean, we've obviously, like I've said this before, but we've obviously all seen the terrors of World War II and the Holocaust forever. But having that movie in my mind and then being able to go and explore these places and be in these areas, it was fascinating to see the grip that the Nazi Party had on Germany, to where like it's all of this horrendous and disgusting things that are happening that it's hard for you to even imagine how another human could be doing these things. But for these kids growing up, this is all they know. They're being taught, okay, this is a group of people that are bad and we hate them and they're demons and blah, blah, blah. But it was so fascinating to go in there with that mindset and be like, this is what was happening here, and just almost like the brainwashing and everything. It was really interesting to say the least.
Yeah, like I remember going into Buchenwald, like we looked around and I don't know if anyone else saw it or not, like a Hitler youth board game, and it's just all Hitler themed. It's so like, oh my God, like it's horrifying to look at, but like you said, you realize just how deep into it everyone was. It's just very interesting, fascinating.
Yeah.
Well, this whole journey has just been such an adventure, and I mean, I for one, I've very much enjoyed traveling with all of you and with this group.
Yeah.
But
Me too.
Dream
It was a
come true
blast.
trip.
I know. Yeah, it was amazing.
It was incredible.
Incredible. Certainly, many of us see world events differently now that we've seen and learned so much. Thanks for joining us in the studio. Hello, Panthers. I'm Lucas Yates, coming at you from Bayeux, France, where we are witnessing the 80th celebration of Victory in Europe Day. The day is not only a celebration of the end of World War II, but it also commemorates all the fallen soldiers across the war. Our multimedia journalism class has been across Bayeux and Normandy, studying the history of World War II. We have walked along the beaches of Normandy, seeing the brutal history that Europe faced during the war. However, as we mourn the thousands of soldiers that we lost, we honor their memory and remember what they brought, a sense of peace to us after the war was over. From Bayeux, France, I'm Lucas Yates, signing off. Au revoir.